Hey there, fellow knowledge seekers. Ready for today's deep dive? We're talking brain plasticity, and more specifically, how the brain rewires itself after losing a sense.
Yeah. We're focusing on our feline friends for this one, right? We're going to break down some really cool research that used MRI scans to actually measure the changes that happen in the brains of deaf cats compared to hearing cats.
Okay, so first things first, how do you even get a cat to sit still for an MRI? I mean, come on.
Right. It's not easy, but it's super important for us to get this really precise data on brain structure. I mean, it's not like we can just ask a cat, hey, how's your auditory cortex doing these days?
Very true.
Right.
So to do this, the researchers used these MRI scans and also a feline brain atlas, which is basically like a map, right, for neuroscientists.
Exactly.
And they used it to zero in on 146 different brain areas.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of brain mapping.
Yeah, it is. It's really impressive. And the really neat part is that they were able to go way beyond just looking at the overall size of the brain. They use this technique called tensor-based morphometry.
Tensor-based morphometry.
Yeah, TBM for short. And it let them analyze the changes in volume across the entire brain.
The entire brain.
Yeah, voxel by voxel.
Voxel by voxel. What exactly is a voxel?
So imagine dividing the brain up into this grid of tiny little cubes.
Dude.
Each one of those tiny cubes is a voxel. It's kind of like a 3D pixel.
Okay.
And with TBM, researchers can measure the size of each one of these voxels and see how they're different between, in this case, deaf and hearing cats.
So it's like comparing two super detailed brain maps.
Exactly.
Side by side.
Exactly.
Looking for even the tiniest little differences.
Yeah. And what they found is that the overall brain volume, it stayed pretty much the same.
Okay.
But there was this really fascinating shift in what we might call brain real estate.
Brain real estate. I like that. Tell me more.
So think of it like this. When one sense, in this case hearing, isn't providing input anymore, the brain, it doesn't just let those areas just sit there,
Right.
It's almost like it reassigns those resources to other senses that are still active.
So are you saying that in deaf cats, the brain might decide to dedicate more resources to vision and touch to kind of make up for that lack of input from hearing?
Exactly. And that's actually what they found. The study found that specific areas of the brain that are associated with vision and touch, those areas were actually larger in the deaf cats compared to the hearing cats.
Oh, okay.
And that's a phenomenon called, get ready for it, compensatory crossmodal plasticity.
Compensatory crossmodal plasticity.
Yeah. But essentially, it just means that the brain is rewiring itself to kind of optimize for the senses that are available.
So it's like the brain is saying, okay, no sound, no problem. Let's make vision and touch even more amazing.
Exactly.
Wow. So where did these changes actually happen in the brain?
Well, these changes were most pronounced, most obvious in the right hemisphere of the brain.
Okay. And what does the right hemisphere do?
So the right hemisphere, it's generally associated with spatial awareness, navigation, and, processing visual information.
Which would make sense, right? If you can't rely on your hearing to navigate, your brain would probably want to enhance those other senses.
Exactly.
And especially vision.
Exactly. And in fact, two specific visual processing areas called AMLS and SVA, they were significantly larger in the deaf cats.
AMLS and SVA.
Okay.
And what do those areas do exactly? What makes them so special?
Well, they're both involved in what we call higher level visual processing, and particularly motion detection. So they help cats track objects.
Oh.
Like if you're, shining a laser pointer around or watching a bird in flight.
So it would make sense that those areas would be larger in deaf cats. But it wasn't all about growth, right?
What?
Some areas of the brain actually shrank in the deaf cats, didn't they?
You're right. Within the auditory cortex itself, two areas, A2 and VAF, those were notably smaller in the deaf cats.
Okay, so now we're talking about areas of the brain that are specifically involved in processing sound.
Right.
And because these cats were deaf, those areas just weren't getting used as much, so they shrank.
Exactly. It's kind of like that old saying, use it or lose it, but for the brain.
Wow.
If a particular area isn't receiving its usual input, the brain might just say, you know what, I'm going to reallocate those resources to other areas that are more active.
Fascinating. So what can you tell us about these areas, A2 and VAF? What do we know about their function?
Well, A2 is still a bit of a mystery, even to us neuroscientists.
Really?
Yeah, I know. It seems to act like a relay station within the auditory cortex, but its exact role is honestly still being researched.
Wow. So even areas we don't fully understand can be impacted by something like deafness.
Absolutely. And I think it highlights just how interconnected the brain is and how changes in one area can have like ripple effects throughout the entire system.
That's incredible. What about VAF?
VAF, we think, might function similarly to A1, which is the primary auditory cortex. It's involved in processing, like the basic features of sound.
So both A2 and VAF, areas that are crucial for processing sound, were smaller in the deaf cats, suggesting that the brain really does reallocate resources based on sensory input. This is incredible. It makes you wonder what else we could learn about brain plasticity from research like this, right? It really is pretty mind-boggling to think that the brain can physically rewire itself.
It really is.
Like in response to changes in sensory input.
Yeah, it's really a testament to how powerful, I guess you would say, experience is at shaping our brains.
Right.
Even at like the structural level.
Yeah. It really makes you think about like, okay, well, if a cat's brain can do this, surely our brains can too, right?
Absolutely. This research on cats, it gives us really valuable insight into how human brains might adapt to similar challenges,
Okay.
especially when it comes to hearing loss.
So what are like some key takeaways for us humans then? What does this mean for like someone who's experiencing hearing loss?
Well, I think first and foremost, it offers us hope.
Okay.
This study really reinforces this idea that the brain is incredibly adaptable. Okay.
Even in adulthood.
Okay, so even if we lose a sense later in life, our brains can still, like, find ways to compensate.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is where like targeted therapies and interventions can really come into play.
Okay.
You know, by understanding how the brain rewires itself after hearing loss, it can help us develop better strategies
Okay.
to enhance those compensatory mechanisms.
So, like, things like cochlear implants?
Yeah.
Or even, like, I don't know, specialized training programs that focus on, like, visual cues or tactile cues?
Exactly.
Mhm.
By understanding how plastic the brain is, we can really start to think about improving the lives of people with hearing impairments.
It's like we're like almost on this cusp of like a whole new era in treating sensory loss.
I think so.
Wow, that's really cool.
And it goes beyond just sensory loss too, right?
Oh, okay.
It can also inform how we understand things like stroke recovery
Okay.
or traumatic brain injury.
Wow, so this is bigger than just cats and hearing then.
This is like a game changer in the world of neuroscience.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about brain regions kind of shifting their roles.
Right.
Is there evidence that these like rewired areas are actually doing something different in these deaf cats?
That's a really good question. And while this particular study really focused on those structural changes, there is a growing body of research showing that these rewired areas are taking on new functions.
So it's not just about size then.
Yeah.
It's about function too.
Exactly. For example, there are studies showing that the rewired auditory cortex in deaf animals actually becomes responsive to visual stimuli.
Interesting.
It's almost like the brain is repurposing those circuits and finding new jobs for those neurons.
Okay, so that's really remarkable. But do those changes in the brain actually translate into behavioral differences?
Yeah.
Like, do deaf cats actually interact with the world differently?
They do, yeah, they do. Deaf animals, and this includes cats, they often develop these enhanced abilities in their other senses. So they might have sharper vision.
Okay.
Or be more sensitive to vibrations.
Okay.
Or even have, like, a heightened sense of smell.
So it's not just their brains that are changing then.
Right.
It's their actual perception of the world.
Exactly.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it shows how remarkable the brain is at adapting and compensating even when it's faced with these huge challenges.
Yeah. You know, this deep dive is really opening my eyes to the power of the brain. But before we go any further, I want to address something that's kind of been on my mind. We've been like praising these positive aspects of brain plasticity, but are there any downsides to this rewiring?
That's a really important point. While plasticity is generally positive, there are some instances where that rewiring can lead to unintended consequences.
Like what? Tell me more.
Okay, so one example is phantom limb pain.
Okay, yeah.
That's a condition where people who have lost a limb, they still experience sensations, often painful, in that missing limb.
Yeah, I've heard of that. That sounds awful.
It's thought to be caused, at least in part, by the rewiring of the brain's somatosensory cortex, which processes our sense of touch. So when the brain isn't getting any input from that missing limb anymore, it can misinterpret signals from other body parts.
So the brain is trying to compensate, but in doing so, it's creating a new problem.
Exactly. It highlights that while plasticity is incredible, it's complex.
Right.
And honestly, we're still learning about how it all works.
It's like this powerful tool that can be used for good or, maybe not so good.
Right.
Just depends on the circumstances.
Exactly. And it's why this ongoing research is so important. The more we understand about how the brain rewires itself, the better we'll be at harnessing that power.
Yeah.
To get those positive outcomes and, I guess, to mitigate the potential negative effects.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all so fascinating, but I feel like we've only just, scratched the surface of brain plasticity.
I think so. We've got a lot more to explore.
Okay.
But for now, how about we take a pause?
Sounds good.
Let's recharge our own neural circuits.
I like that.
We'll be back soon to wrap up this deep dive, and, we can delve into some even more mind-bending implications of all this research.
Welcome back, listeners.
Welcome back.
Our brains are still buzzing from that deep dive into feline brain plasticity.
Yeah, for sure.
Right before the break, we were talking about how this rewiring process, while it's usually beneficial, it can sometimes have downsides.
It's true.
It's like this powerful engine, but it needs the right kind of tuning.
Exactly.
We talk about phantom limb pain.
Yeah.
But, chronic pain conditions are another example of this.
They are.
In some cases, the brain can actually become, hypersensitive to pain signals.
Right.
Even when there's no actual tissue damage. The pain is real, but it's not actually being caused by a physical injury.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's like those pain circuits in the brain, they kind of get stuck in overdrive.
Okay.
And it leads to this persistent pain.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
It is. It is. And again, it just highlights how plasticity, while incredible, it's a delicate process. Yeah. And it can sometimes, go off track.
So how can we make sure it works in our favor?
Yeah.
If it can be good or bad, how do we, tip the scales more towards good?
Well, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I think that's where a lot of the really exciting research is going.
Right.
Because the more we understand those mechanisms of plasticity, the better we can develop therapies and interventions that promote the beneficial rewiring, right? And maybe even prevent or even reverse that maladaptive plasticity.
So it's not just about letting the brain do its thing.
Right.
It's about kind of guiding the process in a more positive direction.
Guiding it, harnessing it for healing and growth.
I love that.
Yeah.
We're becoming brain architects.
I like it.
Sculpting those neural pathways for, optimal well-being.
Yeah, totally.
And speaking of which, how does the concept of neurorehabilitation fit into all of this?
Yeah, so neurorehabilitation is all about using plasticity to help people recover from brain injuries or neurological conditions.
So think physical therapy after a stroke or cognitive training for someone with a brain injury?
Exactly. Right. So these targeted activities, they're basically stimulating the brain to rewire itself, to make new connections and strengthen the ones that are already there.
So it's giving the brain a workout, helping it build those new neural muscles.
I love that. I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
That's great.
It's incredible. But I want to kind of bring this back to the study for a second because, we've been talking about humans.
Right.
But what about our feline friends? How can we take this information and provide better care for deaf cats?
Well, this research really highlights how important it is to provide these deaf cats with a really stimulating, enriched environment. Just because they can't hear, it doesn't mean those brains aren't craving that sensory input.
Right, of course, yeah. So lots of visual stimulation.
Yes.
Interactive toys.
Yes.
Things that really engage their sense of touch and smell.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think, because deaf cats really rely more on their vision to navigate, it's super important to make sure that their environment is well lit.
Yeah, that makes it.
And visually engaging,
It's a good reminder that even if our pets are, experiencing the world differently, their brains are just as capable of adapting and thriving.
Absolutely.
And by understanding, plasticity, we can give them that support they need to live those really full and enriching lives.
Well said. I agree.
This has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive.
It has.
I mean, from, feline brain scans to, the philosophical implications of plasticity.
It's true.
We've covered a lot today.
A lot, yeah.
It's been a journey, and I hope our listeners are, feeling just as inspired as I am by the brain's ability to adapt and really like overcome these challenges.
I do too.
I know I am.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm walking away with like this whole new appreciation for the brain.
Yeah.
And like the power of science to unlock these incredible secrets.
It's really amazing.
It is.
And remember, guys, the brain is dynamic.
Yeah.
It's constantly changing, throughout our lives.
Right.
And I think by like embracing this idea of plasticity,
Yeah.
we can all kind of empower ourselves
Totally.
to live more fulfilling lives.
Well said. I totally agree.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It flew by.
From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.